That was Hey Panchuca, the Royal Crown Revenue recording. It's February 8th, 1988. And for those of you just tuning in, this is A&A Radio on 87.6 FM. I'm Asher Reed.
And I'm Amy Garnett. And on our station, we learn about every genre of music.
Today we have with us Robert Michael Flynn, who's known professionally as Robbie Flynn. He's here to speak to us today about jazz and the civil rights movement. He is a jazz history and performance professor at the Juilliard Conservatory of Music. He has 5 Grammy Awards and tenure at the conservatory.
That is one impressive resume. Now tell me, do you want to be called Professor Flynn or just Robbie?
Robbie's fine. Now I'm here to talk about is jazz, both in the civil rights movement and in a social setting. Many think that jazz caused conflict between races, but in actuality it just brought people together.
Explain that to me, because I always thought the first statement was true.
Well, jazz was created in a time of conflict. It originated with slaves, so it's only natural that it would be seen as an issue between white and black people. Jazz flew under the radar until the 20s, when swing really started to take hold in America. Once white people started to enjoy this music, you had bands with both black and white musicians whose goal was to simply play music together.
But when you had white people playing what could be considered slave music, can't that be considered cultural appropriation?
Well, a colleague of mine says it's all in one's perspective. Certainly whites were appropriating something that was originally black, but they were doing it in jest or hatred. Jazz became enjoyed by all races at this point.
Well, how does that relate to the civil rights movement? The nation was most divided during the 1960s, and I'm curious as to how something as simple as jazz could bring people together.
You know, I once heard jazz described as the music of the free.
That's actually a really good description of jazz. It's very connected to the political movement and helped to ease barriers in society. But first, I'll discuss it in the political world of the civil rights movement.
Was jazz really that involved in politics?
Jazz was heavily involved in politics. Musicians such as Miles Davis, Billy Taylor, and myself routinely performed at fundraisers. There are even civil rights compositions which express the black people's struggles and pains through music. The 2 major ones were the Freedom Now Suite by Max Roach and Abbey Lincoln, and the Fables of Phoebus by Charles Mingus.
Phoebus. Wasn't he a governor? I remember hearing about him in history class in college. He called in the National Guard to prevent desegregation in Arkansas. He even went against the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Ed Supreme Court case.
Yeah, that's him. As you know, he was a Southern Democrat who hated desegregation.
So jazz was used to make political statements, as Mingus did in the Fables of Phoebus?
Jazz was the music of democracy. Musicians expressed their freedom of speech against segregation throughout their music.
Well, I took an undergrad class in music history, and I think jazz is the most democratic form of music. Classical music was created for kings and queens who could fire composers and demand the music that they wanted. Jazz is the opposite. It's about going with the flow, and no one can dictate who plays what. It's really America's music.
Maybe I should just be interviewing you two instead of just Robbie.
Sounds good to me.
Earlier you said that jazz also played a part in breaking social barriers as well. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, sure, jazz helped to...
I was actually talking to our guest who has a degree in this topic.
Right.
Well, so jazz helped to break social barriers because you had white and black musicians in band together, as well as white and black audience members enjoying the music together as well.
What are some of the first examples of a mixed group band?
Well, the most famous example is definitely the Benny Goodman Band, and he's credited for the most important concert in jazz history. Benny Goodman's Carnegie Hall concert of January 16, 1938, brought integration to a segregated concert hall. Goodman said we needed the white and black keys to play together to make good harmony. And on that day, it worked so well that it elevated jazz to a whole new level.
You say that jazz helped to break social barriers, but weren't there still groups who took advantage of black musicians, cultures, and even music within jazz? It's just hard to comprehend that before jazz there were all of these issues, and then after jazz they all just went away.
You're right. Jazz didn't magically solve racism in the industry, but it helped to make audiences, musicians, and venues more accepting. People like to listen to jazz, so as a result, you had audiences of mixed races who just wanted to listen to good music.
Well, do you remember ever playing for any of mixed race audiences? Did jazz actually help bring the audience together?
You know, I remember one night back in 1953 at Club 9, I was playing and overheard this couple talking.
Oh my goodness, that was so good. Frank, don't you think so?
Well, I really love the music, but this crowd's not really my scene.
Oh my gosh, you have to see the worst in everything. Who cares if there were mixed races in the audience? We're here for the same reason we are. To listen to him and just have fun together.
I suppose you're right. I never really thought about it that way. That we're all just here to listen to him play that sweet jazz. Maybe we're not so different after all.
We're the same.
And from that night, I realized how my music could act as a voice for change and help bring people to better understand others and to help break barriers in society. And this inspires me to continue spreading my love for music and just sharing this voice for change.
So while jazz wasn't a magical form of music that fixed all social issues, it helped make racism less of an issue in the industry.
Yes, that's exactly what jazz did.
What about outside of the jazz sphere? I understand that jazz helped musicians and audiences come together, but in the 60s, people either wanted equal rights or they wanted races to be as separate as possible.
Unfortunately, that's sort of where the influence of jazz stops. Jazz did so much for the music industry in helping people and places become more accepting. When bands traveled, oftentimes black musicians had to stay at different hotels than their identical white musician counterparts, simply because of segregation. But jazz brought so many people together. If jazz had never occurred, two things would be different. Obviously, music would be much duller. Secondly, many people wouldn't have been given the opportunities they truly deserved.
Jazz really brought people together.
It really did.
All right, folks, it's time for our listeners to phone in questions they want to ask Robbie Flynn about jazz and the racial barriers.
And here we have our first caller now. State your name and question, please.
Hi, my name is Noah. My question is, how did jazz go from being created out of slavery, a terrible institution, and then go on to help bring people together?
Well, that's a great question, Noah. Jazz comes from slave music, songs they would sing in the fields to make time go by faster, and it evolved to bring people together. It did that by defying the very institution it began in. You see, jazz allowed people to come together no matter their race, just simply make good music. Musicians wanted to play with good musicians, like me, and race wasn't the most important factor on their mind. Jazz has always been to emphasize freedom, and that's what allowed it to evolve and truly bring people together.
And here's our next caller. State your name and question, please.
Hi, Robbie Flynn. My name is Eli, and I'm a huge fan of yours. If jazz brought people together, why couldn't people be brought together in the same way in other areas?
Well, Eli, that's a question that my colleagues and I are still working on to this day. Jazz was ahead of mainstream culture in terms of desegregation and collaboration. You had mixed bands as early as the 20s that were so successful despite the deep-set racism of their time. In my opinion, jazz is able to bring people together because there was never any other purpose to jazz besides making good music. Since the sole purpose of jazz was to make expressive, enjoyable music, it was just so easy to set aside race to do what they loved and just make music.
Well, did you see this in the other forms of art?
Well, unfortunately, other places didn't have this mindset. You didn't see Hollywood setting aside race to make the best possible film because they had sales, audience reaction, even budget to put in consideration. Jazz is a truly special occurrence because it allowed people to set aside the differences in order to do and listen to what they love.
Wow, jazz really was wonderful for this country.
Jazz was truly something wonderful that America has.
Well, folks, it seems like today has come to an end. Thank you, Robbie Flynn, for joining us on today's segment. And for all our listeners out there, join us tomorrow. We have a special guest star, Donatella Menning, who will talk to us about the evolution of show tunes. And that's all for now. I'm Asher Reed.
And I'm Amy Garnett, and we wish you all a good night.